We're so pleased to be able to launch the 2023 Five Towns One Book series here in Croton this year, alongside here in the Lorraine-Hansberry Coalition of Croton, as well as 5 other Westchester County libraries. This year, we're bringing our communities together to explore the life and work of Lorraine Hansberry, playwright, author, and activist. And if any of you are from out of town and you don't know this already, and you're interested in visiting Lorraine Hansberry's grave, she's buried right over there in Bethel Cemetery. And one of our reference librarians actually created these maps, which are on the table outside. I'll put this one out there too. Good research is one of the perks of holding an event at the library. And we also wanted to thank Andy from Biden Books for making Dr. Colbert's book available for sale here. A portion of the proceeds go to the library, so thank you so much for your generosity. And again, if you're from out of town and you haven't checked out this sweet, sweet shop right next to the Black Cow, make sure to go inside the Black Cow and then up the stairs and you can find the shop. So thank you all again for coming, and now I'm going to turn it over to Kira to continue the introductions.
Hello everyone, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Anne Lobu and I'm the chair of the board of CURE, which stands for the Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. And we're really proud to be here today with the Croton Free Library, the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition, and all of our other Westchester partners to present this special event to you. Our mission is to bring education around the topics of systemic and structural racism to our neighbors. We're located in Larchmont and Merrimack in order, as a first step towards dismantling racism. I'd like to give a special thank you to Catherine Parker and the Board of Legislators for their generous funding of today's program and the series that's going to continue from here. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Signe Bergstrom, and together with Linda Jones, I am co-chair of the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition here in Croton. The Lorraine Hansberry Coalition is a volunteer-led village committee dedicated to providing inclusive and community-based programming that both educates the public on the life and legacy of Lorraine Hansberry and celebrates her work in activism. Later this year, the LHC is hosting a week-long program at various venues throughout Croton to celebrate the 60th anniversary of a rally that Lorraine Hansberry chaired here at Temple Israel. That original rally took place in 1963 and drew over 1,000 people, which is a pretty good crowd for Croton. It originally the rally originally helped support the Southern Freedom Movement and all voting rights in the South during that time. Our kickoff event for that commemoration will be June 11th at Temple Israel, so hold the date, and I'm sure you guys will see posters and flyers in the next couple of months. Before I hand everything over, I want to thank you, Gwen, so much, and Jesse and the staff, the board of the Croton Free Library for hosting us here. I also want to thank you, Andy, for buying the books, for being here. And of course to CURE, without whom this would not be possible. So thank you very much. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce the members of the panel to everybody. This is a big introduction. Thank you. Oh, no, okay, really?
Just got scary.
For over 20 years, the Westchester County Human Rights does this make a difference?
No. It's further straight.
For over 20 years, the Westchester County Human Rights Commission has been combating discrimination by enforcing the county's human rights law and fair housing law, and by empowering the community through its education and outreach efforts. The Commission accepts, investigates, and adjudicates discrimination complaints in employment, housing, places of public accommodations, and certain hate-related incidents. Tejas joined the Commission as its executive director in 2019. Welcome. I'm also very happy to introduce Nicole Alfonte, founder of CURE, as well as our very own Linda Jones, Croton resident and co-chair of the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition. And of course, the reason we are all here, Professor Colbert. Professor Colbert, I know that Linda is going to give a biography and more details about your professional accomplishments, so I will spare everybody from me rambling on. So I will just say to you instead, thank you so very much for making the trek here to Croton to spend an afternoon with us, and for keeping the vision of Lorraine Hansberry alive and well in the year 2023. for everybody here, members of the LHC are here. We're all wearing these little stickers. We are a small group. We are a mighty group. We do lots of work. We're looking for new members. So if anyone here in Croton would like to join or get more information about us, please come and speak to one of us after the event. Thank you.
Coming this afternoon. There will be a book signing and an opportunity to ask Dr. Colbert a few questions later on in the program. So I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Colbert. Suika Diggs Colbert is the Idle Family Professor of African American Studies and Performing Arts at Georgetown University. Her award-winning book, Radical Vision, a biography of Lorraine Hansberry, narrates a life at the intersection of art and politics, arguing that for Hansberry, the theater operated as a rehearsal room for her political and intellectual work. Dr. Colbert has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities to support a residency at the Schomburg Center, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Stanford University, Mellon Foundation, and the Robert W. Woodruff Library at Emory University. She's also lectured nationally and internationally at universities, high schools, and middle schools, as well as for civic and arts organizations. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Public Books, Metrograph, and American Theater. She's been interviewed on NPR and commented for the New York Times, USA Today, CNN, and the Washington Post. She is an associate director at the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C. She has also served as a creative content producer for the Public Theater's audio play Shadowland. Her research interests span the 19th through 21st centuries, from Harriet Tubman to Beyonce, and from poetics to performance. So please welcome Dr. Colbert to Croton. So I also have the pleasure of asking the first question. So we're going to start at the beginning. In your book, you acknowledge and thank your family. So tell us what life was like for you growing up.
So I grew up in a middle-class town that was predominantly black, Willingboro, New Jersey. So I grew up in the tri-state area. And often when I'm trying to help my students, I teach at Georgetown, help my students get an understanding of my matriculation. I also graduated from Georgetown. I was an undergraduate there. I recall that my mother purposefully moved us to Willingboro, New Jersey, because she was really invested in cultivating a sense of self that allowed us to see blackness as something that was expansive and beautiful and full, and not associated with a lot of the negative stereotypes that accrue around blackness in the world. And so almost everyone in my community played a different role, but many of them were African American. So there were black firefighters and doctors and lawyers and custodians. And so you saw black people filling lots of different roles. I saw black people filling lots of different roles. And so I didn't associate blackness with a certain station in life. And it wasn't actually until I went to Georgetown where I was confronted with all of these negative associations with blackness. But by the time I got there, to echo James Baldwin, I knew what they were saying about me wasn't true, as he says in the letter to his nephew in The Fire Next Time. And so my parents had built up such a strong sense of self that I was able to recognize the negative images that I was receiving as not a reflection of me, but rather a reflection of the people that were mirroring them to me. And so in retrospect, it was really sort of idyllic from that standpoint. I mean, obviously, it wasn't perfect, but there are ways that I'm really grateful to my parents for creating that context for my childhood.
Thank you. We should all be grateful to our parents.
Yes, we should all be grateful to our parents. Yes.
Thank you so much for that.
So, in your interview with Brian Phillips from the Society of Women of Ideas, he said that your book was the book many of us have been waiting for. What drew you to Lorraine Hansberry and prompted you to write this biography?
So I have been writing about Lorraine Hansberry since my first book, and from that matter, since my dissertation. And what drew me to her and her work, I think, is similar to most Americans' introduction to her, which was, first through A Raise in the Sun, which, let's just all be, honest, is a perfect play. And so that was my first introduction to her. And of course, there's all of the ways that she became an American darling. She's beautiful, she's young, she's so brilliant, this perfect play. And then when I was in graduate school, I started reading her other published works. And I really became curious about the play LeBlanc, which is set in a post-colonial moment in an imagined African country. And so when I started writing Radical Vision, the first play that I wrote about or began to do research on was LeBlanc. And I realized that Hansberry had been writing about independence movements in Africa since she moved to New York in 1950. And so, and I can say more about why that's significant, but to answer your question more specifically, what drew me to her is, I think, some of the characteristic ways that the American public has been drawn to her. But once I was able to visit her archive, I fell in love with her brilliance, because the depth and breadth of her work and insight is so much broader than the published work. And so I'm really grateful to the Trust and to the Schomburg, because both the Lorraine Hansberry Literary Trust and the Schomburg gives us an opportunity to really delve into the depths of her work and her production that is much more expansive than what we have in just the published work.
I want to say to you that your book is really, you feel how much you love her in your book. I think, Linda, you might have the next question.
Up again. Okay.
You're the author or co-editor of several books and articles on theater, African American actors, and American history. So what makes these topics so compelling that you have made them your life's work?
I used to say that I had the best job in the world, and in some ways I still do, although now I spend well, I won't say that. I am very
It's Croton, we're all friends here.
So I now do a lot of administrative work with the university, which comes with, having more advancement in your career as a professor. And so my job used to be spending all my time teaching and writing about culture. And so I would read all of this brilliant cultural production, and then I would spend time talking to eager, well-prepared young people about it. Like, what better job in the world is that? So I started thinking I want to become a professor my sophomore year in college, when I took a seminar on the works of Toni Morrison, and we read all of her novels that had been published up to that point. And I was blown away not only by her craft, which of course is unparalleled, but also because Morrison was able to give voice to things as a 19-year-old that I was only on the cusp of understanding. And so I could relate to experientially, but I didn't have the language yet to articulate them. And so Morrison gave me a window into language, into how to articulate things. And I remember just thinking of how impactful that was, and wanting to be able to share that type of experience with students, and to be able to write in a way that helped other people have a clearer sense of what they're experiencing in the world. And so those were the initial draw. At 19, I really didn't understand what it meant to be a professor, but I remember sitting in my classroom and thinking, I want to do this. I want to have this impact, really, which is what I was sensing at the time. And so my experiences evolved from there, but at the root of it, I write about culture, so I write about music and dance and theater and literature, and at the base of it, there's a deep sense of satisfaction from engaging with cultural objects. But with the Hansberry book, I also came to realize that these cultural objects were a means of survival for me, particularly during the pandemic. And so there's also that gift of being able to engage with artists who give us a vision for a future that we can't even apprehend in the current moment.
And your book came out during the...
So the book came out in 2021. I was writing it from 16 to maybe 20. Mm-hmm. And so the period of writing it was very different from the period of it being in the world. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, I think your career background and your introduction to a professor gives us a good segue to this question about, as a professor of African American Studies at Georgetown, what is it like to teach African American Studies today when there is so much of a false narrative that's being told in our country?
Well, I count myself to be very blessed that I have tenure. And I take the responsibility that comes along with that. And so because of that privilege, I am protected to be able to say things and do things that some of my colleagues can't. Folks in publicly funded elementary and secondary schools can't. So teaching African American Studies at Georgetown in a blue city that for the most times is surrounded by 2 blue states, not right now, but for the most part, is a different proposition than so there's a set of protections there that I'm very clear about. But to answer your question specifically about this moment, there's a lot of violence that comes along with teaching, not physical violence, but people send you nasty emails and they're, there's this virulent to aggressiveness to people's responses to your work that has not always been part of the work. And so you just have to get a tough skin with that. And I think that the bigger picture for me as an educator is that we know that in a democracy, having full and open access to education is a fundamental part of the democracy functioning. We know having access to voting rights is a fundamental part of a democracy functioning. So when we start to say certain bodies of knowledge are off limits, then I think as a citizen, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, that should be cause for concern.
So well said, thank you.
The opening quote in the introduction to your book captured my interest immediately. It reads, "Daddy died, Raisin opened, and yesterday I got a divorce, all on March 10th, 1945, 1959, 1964. You state that these 3 major events occurring over 20 years served as essential moment to Lorraine Hansberry becoming free. So tell us why you began with that quote and how these events shaped Lorraine Hansberry.
So Hansberry was a daddy's girl. She loved her father. She loved her mother too, but I talk about in the book both losing her father so young and then not having to wrangle with the gender comparison, I think allowed her to idealize him in ways that she just didn't with her mother. And so her father, she writes about, talks about, continues to mourn her father throughout her life. She talks about, she says at one point that racism helped to kill him. His legacy of being the person that files a lawsuit in Hansberry v. Lee that tries to eliminate racially restrictive housing covenants in Chicago is part of the inspiration for A Raisin in the Sun. So he continues to inform her work in politics throughout her life and has a lasting imprint. And then obviously Raisin opened, I mean, we know why that was a turning point. But I also think that one of the things that I'll draw, that I think I could put an exclamation point on, is how, I mean, deeply improbable it was that Raisin ended up on Broadway, but also there were several moments where it could not have happened. So there are all of these moments in the story of Raisin in the Sun where it almost does not make it to Broadway, which I also think is an interesting part of the story. At the end of her life, so Hansberry and Robert Nimroff, I talk about this in the book too, have what I would call an unconventional marriage. So he knows from the very beginning that she's queer. He is, to borrow a phrase from Toni Morrison, a true friend of her mind. And so when I first entered the archive, I was a little skeptical about, this man and what was up with, him and Lorraine. But I came to realize that he truly respected and honored her intellect, and she trusted him. And so even after, they get divorced in 1964 before she dies, and she still names him as executor of her trust, which I think is important as just a moment, an anecdote of the nature of their relationship. And so the divorce marks an ending of a certain type of lifestyle that she's leading, but I also think, and a shift for her in terms of, how she wants to live her life publicly and personally, but I don't think that it was a rupture in terms of the nature of their relationship. And they continue to work together. There's drafts of Sign and Cindy Brucein's Window with him giving her notes, well until the end, till the play goes to Broadway. So they maintained a very close and intimate intellectual relationship, but their romantic relationship had ended well before 1964. So to me, it's more about how she was thinking about living her life in that moment moving forward than it is about the two of them's relationship.
So most people know Lorraine Hansberry from A Raisin in the Sun. And she was, to have died at 34, what transpired in her mind before that was so much more than A Raisin in the Sun. And she did such incredible things. So can you talk a little bit about, and especially sort of pertains to that Mike Wallace interview, like what does the general public know about her? What was she really about? What were the deeper, more multifaceted things that were going on with her? And I think, I don't want to give it away, but there is also an original ending to Raisin, right? That was not what we see.
Yeah.
So can you speak on that, please?
So right now I curated an exhibit at BAM that's coinciding with their production of Sign and Cindy Brucein's Window that's there right now. The reason I'm bringing that up is because they digitized all of these recordings of Hansberry, one of which is the Mike Wallace interview. And heretofore, you could only access those recordings on CDs, which is why no one has heard them. So if you want to listen to the interview, you can go on to BAM's website and listen to it today. So one of the things that's fascinating to me about this interview when I teach it to my students is, one, you have to remember this is 1950s US. So, and Hansberry is a black woman. So at one point, Mike Wallace says to her, "Oh, you're just a housewife that wrote a play." It's so fascinating because it really draws our attention to how different the world was in 1959 versus in 2023. Because first of all, Hansberry had been writing for radical periodicals for a decade before she writes A Raisin in the Sun. If that happened now, whoever the interviewer would have Googled Hansberry and seen all of these leftist red, she's a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Yep. She's writing to lesbian periodicals. None of that is seemingly a part of the public understanding of who she is. People think that she just woke up one morning and decided to write a play. It's the first thing she ever wrote, and here we have A Raisin in the Sun, and look how wonderful this is. And the housewife part is also a misunderstanding, because Hansberry is the breadwinner with her and Robert Nimroff, and she's the one she's helping to generate the income. He is the breadwinner up until Raisin in the Sun, but once the play is produced, she really is the one who is generating income in the household. So it's a fascinating understanding of her, or misunderstanding of her. But the other part of the interview that I think is instructive is there are all of these moments where he misunderstands the play or mischaracterizes her, and she corrects him, and he completely ignores what she just says, and then says the same thing over again. And so you hear her deliberateness in her voice, in her calm, in her just brilliance of language, and you also see the power of this man who has no frame of reference to apprehend the person sitting in front of him. And so this is part of how you get a narrative of her that is in some ways true, but in many ways not complete about who she was in the world. There's this other really telling moment in the interview. So Mike Wallace becomes famous in 1959 because he does this series of interviews called The Hate That Hate Produced. And it's about the Nation of Islam, and he depicts this radical rabble-rouser named Malcolm X. And he says, I know you're not like him. I know that you're different. And Hansberry says, no, You know, many of the things that the nation, you know, there are some things I disagree with, but some of the things they're saying I agree with. And so again, he's just like, oh, no, you can't be like, and so there's all of these fascinating moments where he paints a picture of Hansberry that she adamantly resists, but still he can't hear her.
Well, he chooses.
He chooses not to hear her, yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the end of Raisin? I don't know.
Oh, yes. So the multiple versions of Raisin are cataloged at the Beinecke at Yale. And one of the early versions of A Raisin in the Sun depicts the family. So we all know the story. So the family moves. And in the published version of the play, we just have the family, the moving truck coming and the family packing up boxes and leaving the apartment. And so there's sort of this anticipation that what's going to happen next. But in one of the versions, we have them actually in the new house, and they are armed and waiting for, you know, vigilantes who are physically protesting them being there. And so when Hansberry's family in 1940, I don't know if desegregate is the right word, but they end up moving into this segregated neighborhood, which then so then they moved to the segregated neighborhood on the edges of, on the south side of Chicago, but close to the University of Chicago. The neighbors want to push them out because they violated a racially restricted housing covenant. Hansberry's father sues, and that is the court case Hansberry v. Lee. And while he is in Washington fighting for his family's right to live in this neighborhood, the neighbors throw a rock through the Hansberry's window that almost hits young Lorraine. Her mother guarded the house with a Luger pistol. So while her father is off in Washington fighting, Hansberry is seeing her armed mother guarding their house. And so Hansberry at 10 sees the limits of the courts. So by the time we get to 62 and 63, when the civil rights generation is getting impatient with the speed of progress from the courts, Hansberry already has learned this lesson 20 years ago. And so she makes a speech that says, we have to use every means at our disposal to dismantle racism. The courts, self-defense, we have to use everything in our power to dismantle racism, because for 20 years she has been learning this lesson. And so it's not that she gives up on the courts, but it's at a very early age she sees the limits. And so the Supreme Court decides that although the Hansberry family has the right to buy that house in that neighborhood, that racially restrictive housing covenants are not unconstitutional on their face. And it's not until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act that it becomes illegal to discriminate selling a house based on race.
And I think that's the perfect segue to talk about our next topic. Is in her life, you can see the impact and how pervasive housing discrimination was. And you could see how that was one of the major themes in Raisin in the Sun. Ms. Hansberry passed away in 1965. She passed away 3 years before the Federal Fair Housing Act was passed. Today, studies have shown that the disparity between white home ownership and black ownership is greater today than it is in the 1960s before the law was passed. What do you think Lorraine Hansberry would have to say about that?
She'd be rolling over in her grave, but I think that she's probably out there rolling over as we speak. I mean, I think in part she may not be surprised, because one of the things that was so illuminating to me is because she had this history, because she grew up with the Popular Front generation of activists, she was writing things that we would now think of as Black Power texts before she died, right? So she was already anticipating that the civil rights agenda would not be sufficient to achieve freedom. But at the same time, I do think that she fundamentally believed that there was a possibility for coalition formation that could actualize our democracy. And I think she would be deeply disappointed that that has not borne more fruit in the material realities of folks living in the United States today. So I don't know, but many of the things she was writing about in, from 1950 to when she died in 1965 are still ongoing issues in our current moment. Chicago is still deeply segregated. Most major U.S. cities are, and people who go to public schools go to schools in their districts. And so there's ripple effects of segregation in terms of our cultural, and the way it impacts our cultures.
I think it's very well said, and we still see structural issues in terms of appraisal discrimination, lending discrimination, redlining that exists today.
Absolutely.
So, you know, we think of Lorraine Hansberry, obviously Raisin in the Sun, and some of her other more radical work, but perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about her sense of humor, that most people don't think she had a sense of humor.
Oh my God. Lorraine Hansberry would be the person you want to invite to your dinner party. She loved to laugh. She loved a good debate. If she was alive today, she would be a menace on Twitter because there was never a debate that she backed down from. And you see this exemplified in all the letters she's constantly writing to newspapers telling them how they got something wrong about her or otherwise. But she was, so there is a set of images at the exhibition, and I'm not sure if they're available online, but David Addy, who's a photographer, took a series of pictures of Lorraine Hansberry in 1959 that were featured in Vogue magazine. And many of them show Hansberry very stately and beautiful, as we often see her depicted. But there's this set of images that were never published that are in the exhibition that show her laughing and dancing and moving about. And so we wanted to feature those images because they give us a different side of her personality. This comes out some in Baldwin writing about Hansberry as well, and their deep friendship. She was a prankster. She liked to play jokes on people. This comes up in some of the interviews of cast members with Lloyd Richards around a Raisin in the Sun. So she was playful. I mean, she was a 20-something living in New York by herself with a little bit of money in her pocket. So, you know, so she had a full spectrum of her personality. And actually, the one place that you can actually hear this is that there's a roundtable conversation with Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry. And in the banter and the back and forth of the conversation, the three of them start joking with one another. And it's one of the few moments where there's a break in the seriousness where they often present their public face, and you can hear the lovingness of their relationships and the intimacy between them. And so you get a window into that side of her personality, and Hughes and Baldwin as well.
Are you familiar with that line in Baldwin's eulogy to her at the very end? I mean, I watched it online, and I was in the library crying by myself. I was like, somebody stop me. But there, at the end of the eulogy, he talks about one of the last moments he sees her, and she's sick, but she's dressed up and she looks beautiful, and he makes some comment about how beautiful she looks, and she has this unbelievable line where she says, well, you have to adopt a fatal illness, or something like that. But it's just they're right there. It was just, really powerful.
Their relationship is so beautiful, and I have taught several times the essay Sweet Lorraine that he writes after her death, which is the main thrust of the essay is about this meeting that Baldwin, Hansberry, Harry Belafonte, Rip Torn, and others have with Bobby Kennedy about the uprising in the South. And Baldwin describes the conversation, but what is telling to me in that, in his portrayal of the events, is he describes Hansberry, and this is similar to what you just described. So the civil rights activists get called to meet with Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy wants this civil rights activist to tell those young people on the streets to go home and stop messing things up because his brother's trying to get reelected. It's 1964. Baldwin et al. Want the president and attorney general to make a stronger statement about civil rights. So they come to the meeting already at odds, and everyone leaves frustrated because the Kennedy administration is not willing to say something more profound about civil rights, and the artists are not willing to back down from their position. And so Baldwin describes Hansberry walking away from the meeting being dejected. And at this point, she's sick, so she's also physically showing the signs of her illness. And then she goes home and works on Sign and Sidney Brustein's Window, the play about Toussaint Louverture, Toussaint, and LeBlanc. And so after having lost the diplomatic fight, she goes to work. And that is part of how Baldwin wants us to remember her, and it's such a lovely remembrance of who she was in the world that she was going to use every means at her disposal. So if diplomacy doesn't work, we're going to do something else, but we're not going to stop until we get the freedom that we envision.
And I will add that less than a month after that meeting with Kennedy and Baldwin, she chaired the rally here at Temple Israel.
Yep.
Which is what we're going to commemorate in June.
Yep.
And I think most of the people in the room here, and if you talk about Lorraine Hansberry, would recognize her as a signifier for racial justice. But it wasn't until after she passed that many people understood that she was also a signifier and an activist for queer issues as well. Can you talk about some of her issues struggling with her sexuality? You've talked about her marriage and maybe the relationship there.
So Hansberry was not, in her friend circles, folks knew that she was queer. And as I said before, she writes letters, and there's evidence that Robert Nimroff knew that as well, her husband and then ex-husband. But certainly publicly, no one knew that. And you have to remember that at the time, and Hansberry writes about this in her letters to the latter, which were depicted at the Brooklyn Museum and are at the Schomburg. So the latter is the first lesbian periodical. And Hansberry writes 2 letters to the organization in 1957 at the same time that she's writing Raising the Sun. And in it, she details what are the structural barriers to women being openly in relationships to women. And it's not only the surveillance of the police and the harassment and the laws that are prohibiting full access, but Hansberry also draws attention to the economic constraints. And that is a key point that in her intersectional view of the world, she's always drawing our attention to. So again, this is 1950s America. This is the height of heterosexual marriage in the United States. This is the beginning of the baby boomer generation. And many women are still dependent on men for their sustenance. And so the choice of being in a same-sex relationship has an economic component as well. And so obviously by the time Hansberry has a Raising the Sun produced, she could afford financially to be a lesbian. But part of what I think is important for us to understand is that it was a very complicated time in terms of the Lavender Scare, the implications for her at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality, and then of course, what it would mean overall for her ability to have the political impact that she wanted to have. And I guess the last thing I'll say about that is James Baldwin talks in The Fire Next Time and elsewhere about how he understands himself being perceived as a gay man in the movement and the impact that has on him. So I don't know, Hansberry definitely, her intimates knew that she was gay, but obviously the wider world didn't know. And I think that there has been greater awareness of her same-sex desire and queerness and how that appears in her archive with the stewardship of the most recent stewardship of the trust.
Yeah, no, and then you can understand why she may not want to project it publicly at that time with the societal constraints. And then you just think about the constraints that are being proposed nationwide today. There's 298 anti-LGBTQ bills that are being proposed across the country. What do you think Ms. Hansberry would say about the state of our nation, talking about gender fluidity and all these proposed bills?
Again, I think she would be deeply concerned, disturbed. She would be getting to work about building a coalition to fight against these. That's what she would be doing. She would be organizing. And she would be on the ground organizing because she thought that the only way to help all of us achieve a full sense of freedom in the United States was via grassroots mass movements of people. So of her roles, she was most uncomfortable with the idea of herself as a spokesperson, and she really bristled at the idea that anyone could speak for a group. She thought the group should speak for itself. And so I think if Hansberry were alive today and seeing these laws, she would be on the ground organizing.
We miss her.
Did we skip over one of your questions, Elizabeth?
Maybe.
Go back.
Here it is. You taught a course at Georgetown entitled Baldwin, Simone, and Hansberry. So what prompted you to develop that course, and how would you describe the significance of that triumvirate?
So powerful. 2 of the 3 lived in Westchester County, so this is a magical place, apparently.
Now you know.
Yes, now
the
I
secret
know.
is out.
Into it, yes. So I was curious about the relationships between Hansberry, Baldwin, and Simone, who all had friendships among each other. So Hansberry had friendships with the 2 of them, and the 2 of them were friends as well, Simone and Baldwin. And of course, Simone and Baldwin lived much longer than Hansberry, and so their relationship is detailed over time after Hansberry passes away. And so I was curious about her friend circle, what it meant to be an inspiration to one another, how they supported one another, how they were able to show different sides of themselves together. In Simone's biography, she talks about Hansberry coming to her house in Westchester County and politicizing her and, asking her, what are you doing for the people? What are you doing for the movement? You're singing all these songs and making all this money, but what are you doing for the movement? And so I wanted to understand how their friendships helped to enable the world-class art that they produced. And there are all of these lovely anecdotes that they have about their relationship. Baldwin tells this story about when he first met Lorraine. He was doing a workshop of Giovanni's room at Studio Theater in New York, and he said there was all of the New York theater intelligentsia there, and they were telling him how horrible his play was. And then he said he heard this little voice in the back, someone raised their hand, this small woman, and said, I thought it was good. and that was how they met, and that was Lorraine Hansberry. And so there are all these lovely moments of affirmation, and going back to the Mike Wallace piece, these moments where they see each other in a world where they're constantly being misrecognized, that I wanted to understand, because I thought that these relationships were central to who each of them was able to become in the world and what they were able to do together.
There's a quote of Nina Simone in your book, I don't remember it exactly, so I hope you do, where she describes their relationship as girlfriends, and she said, we talk about the things that girlfriends talk about.
Marx, Lenin, yeah, we were,
right.
Yeah, real girls talk. Marx, Lenin, Hansberry, in the same passage, Nina Simone says that Hansberry knew she was beautiful by herself, so she would resist wearing makeup. She only had a few dresses. And even though when you read in her journals, again, a 20-something-year-old, early 30s, it's not that she is not concerned with or self-conscious about her appearance, but she lived and breathed her politics. And so she was committed politically to not focusing on accumulation. And so she only had a few dresses. And that is how she carried herself in the world. And so for her, even though sometimes she was uncomfortable appearing in certain ways, that she thought it was important for the work she wanted to do in the world.
So the word freedom. Let's just sit with that word for a second. It resonates throughout the book. It keeps coming up, and it's used as, it was collaboration for her, it was a practice, it was through art, it was for working class people. And then you say there's never been an institution of Negro life which has not had a preoccupation with freedom. I don't know if that was something she said or you quoted in the book, but that was not I didn't have a preoccupation with freedom. And so what does that word mean? What did it mean to her? How do you practice it? And then how does that also connect to her organizing? Because also you write over and over again that she was sort of obsessed with the encounter, with like the connection, with actually rolling up her sleeves and looking face to face at people and organizing. which I think is different than if she had just sat at her typewriter. So there's like that ability to go from the intellect to like the person that's sweating with the crowd is a very different experience.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to come back to this last part about encounter, because I think the way it manifests in our current moment is very different than what Hansberry would have even imagined in the early 60s or late 1950s. One of the reasons that I focus on the idea of freedom as a practice is because the word practice, and when I'm using the word practice, I mean, you know, when somebody's practicing a scale on the piano, or, you know, if you have a certain type of spiritual practice, or if you have a certain type of physical practice like yoga, that it's something that is routine, that you try at, that sometimes you get wrong, that you do on a daily basis, and that you're always moving towards, and that you're not expecting to finish, but that it's an ongoing part of who you are, your being in the world. And that it's as important to focus on practicing your scales as the performance itself. Because it's in those moments where you are forming yourself, when you're in formation. And so Hansberry understood her work, and she writes about this in the photo essay, The Movement, which is a collaboration between her and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She understood her work as spanning from being connected to the slave insurrections in the 18th and 19th centuries all the way to the present. And that she was a link in a chain of activity that happened before her and that would go on after her death. And so it wasn't about arriving at a place. It wasn't about arriving at the Voting Rights Act or arriving at the Fair Housing Act, because there will always be more work to be done. And so that's why the word practice is useful for me, because she understood her work as iterative, and this comes out of her feminism. Hansberry, again, saw the way that women were organizing behind the scenes to help support the civil rights movement. She understood that there were all of these court cases that were filed that led to Brown v. Board, that tried and failed, but set the foundation for the successful case. And so she understood freedom as something that, just like injustice is built over time, you know, I'm not going to give any light to that, but just like there are some other recent events that have been built towards over decades of, you know, investment, similarly, that's how you build a movement towards freedom. It's not just, you don't just wake up one morning and have a Supreme Court that finds the voting rights, or have an administration that passes the Voting Rights Act. There are all of these layers of work that activists do over decades to get to that point. And because of her parents, she understood that long history. And so that's why for me, it was important to think about the intergenerational transfer and how Hansberry understood her work in that tradition. In terms of the encounter, Hansberry stages all these moments in her short stories. She wrote short stories, she wrote novels, she wrote plays, she wrote essays, she wrote a film. I mean, I know that we only know Raising the Sun, but she was out there, y'all. She was writing in every genre. She wrote poetry. And in all of the genres, she stages encounters, these moments of debate, often moments of misrecognition, where there's this collision and an opportunity to see things differently. And when you were reading your question, I was a little bit pained in this moment, because our society is so fractured that it's much more rare for you to be in conversation with someone who you disagree with politically. But Hansberry saw those moments as the moments of possibility. Like, in a robust, respectful debate, is there a way for us each to walk away with a deeper understanding? And so I think that she would be very sad by the state of affairs where folks with different points of view can't even sit in the room together, because it just erupts into such vitriol and misinformation and sort of just misrepresentation of the other person's point of view. But that is where she saw democracy and possibility happening, in those moments where folks see things differently and they're able to really hash things out and maybe not come to an agreement, but come to some deeper understanding.
That'd be so wonderful. We came to an agreement in one conversation.
Well, but many of them are failed. That's the thing. Like, in the plays,
So you've touched on this, I think, a little bit in your answers. if someone were to ask, how would you adopt a freedom practice? I guess one could be having conversations with people who disagree with you. Would there be any other things you'd advise?
So let me just say, this is a hard one for me, but I think that Hansberry would say one thing we could all do on a daily basis is not take more than we need. And so then that makes some introspective work about what does one need and what is the basic level for everyone's needs to be met and how that could be a goal for our society. But I think that's something that she would want us all to strive for, and that's something that you can try at, fail at, do again the next day. I'm trying to reduce your waste. I mean, she would have been, again, deeply concerned about our environment and the impact of obviously corporations, but then also our individual impact on the environment as well. So that would be one thing that I would say. And then the other way that one might practice freedom is really being clear about where you sit in the world and what you have access to, and trying to empower and support others. So the piece that I didn't say about Hansberry and Baldwin and Rip Torn and Lena Horne's visit with Bobby Kennedy is that there are several different versions of this event. But if you read all of the folks in the room, they all agree that there was a moment of where things were getting heated. And Hansberry said to Bobby Kennedy, you should not be listening to the Negro intelligentsia about what you should do. You should be listening to Jerome Smith, who was the only grassroots activist in the room. You should be listening to him to figure out what your marching orders should be. And this was classic Hansberry, of having the spotlight on her and redirecting attention to the young people who are fighting on the ground. And so I think, for me at least, empowering my students, figuring out how I can support them, figuring out how I can make ways for them to be who they want to be in the world is something that I do on a daily basis, but certainly you could think about at your job or in your neighborhoods, how that might manifest itself.
And what a great example of just building a coalition in that one meeting.
Right.
And lifting somebody else up.
Yeah.
Linda, can I jump in real quick? So two things are resonating with me. This is a little off-the-cuff question. If you want to pass, you have full privilege to pass. But what is freedom to you?
Well,
I mean, I feel like I know what it is to me, but what is
Nina Simone famously said, you might have seen this video, that it's a feeling of no fear, which I think resonates with me, but it also, I think, is an ongoing struggle. And so there are glimpses of moments of possibility, but one of the things that got me through the pandemic was I realized that, so I began the book with Hansberry making a speech during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Middle Civil Rights Movement, Cuban Missile Crisis, the world seems like it's falling apart. And Hansberry gives this really beautiful speech that you should all read. But the moment resonated differently with me during the pandemic because it helped me to think about how other folks have made it through moments of multiple crises. And so for me, freedom is not only like the moments of when it looks like we're making progress, but it also are those moments of being able to make it to the next moment of progress, which is to say, how do we get over? How do we get to survive through whatever iteration of horribleness that beset our society in that moment? And so having had access to her papers was such a gift because it taught me a lot of lessons of how people survive during dark times. And so I think that thinking about how to build, once again, building coalitions, laying the foundation for that next moment when we are able to seemingly leap forward in history is also a part of how I understand freedom practices.
I think it's also being patient, just to understand that you have to play the long game. Mm-hmm. It doesn't come quickly and it doesn't end quickly.
Yep. You think when you see the moments of jumping forward, these leaps forward, seeming leaps forward in history, that things come quickly, but that's a misapprehension of what has happened historically, and it's a disservice to us to allow those narratives to propagate. And I think, again, the day-to-day things was a part of how Hansberry understood women's work and the importance of it to creating structures of justice.
Mm-hmm. And we often think once we've made this big leap, the issue has been settled.
Right.
And we all know that's not true. So you've been thinking about Hansberry for a long time, spent several years writing the book. So what did you learn about yourself while uncovering the complexity of Lorraine Hansberry?
I was misinformed about the scope of her work. So that was an eye-opening experience, and my own arrogance and naivete when I first came to the Schaumburg. I mean, because it's like, you just sometimes wonder, how could I have been so silly? Because her finding aid is on the website, so you see how many boxes it is. So how could I have not realized how expansive her body of work was? So that was something that I learned, just my own ignorance about someone who I thought I knew a lot about. But more personally, I learned how small, I think I have more clarity now about how day-to-day actions and small decisions matter. And how they help to build psychological, intellectual muscles that you can draw from at later times. And so again, just thinking about how I govern my day-to-day practices, I think about that differently now than I did before I started doing this research.
You're right about, I think an author's life sometimes is solitary work. They're at the Schaumburg, they're in the library, and they're reading papers. But you talk about how Ms. Hansberry really liked the collaborative process in writing a play. Rehearsal, working with actors. Was there a collaborative process that you enjoyed in writing this book?
There is. So when I had my fellowship at the Schaumburg, as a fellow, you're part of a writing community. And so every Wednesday we met and we would workshop chapters from different fellows' work. So that was a lovely part of having the fellowship. And then you're also in community with the brilliant librarians and the archivists. I would not have been able to write my book without the brilliance of librarians and archivists. So one example of that is, I did not know that Hansberry co-wrote a pageant with Alice Childress, which is in Childress's papers, not Hansberry. But of course, the brilliant archivist told me that, and so I then read the pageant. And there were lots of other moments where the archivist told me things that helped push me forward in the work that I was doing. So being in community with the folks at the Schaumburg was also amazing. And then subsequently, I've been part of writing groups and had opportunities to workshop my work and events like this that have also propelled the scholarship.
Some folks in the room might not know about the Schaumburg. Do you want to give a shout out to the Schaumburg?
So the Schaumburg is everything. And let me just say, talk about your tax dollars at work. Okay, libraries, museums, whenever I'm visiting these spaces, I feel even more happy that my tax dollars are being charged. So the Schaumburg is a part of the New York Public Library. It's the Harlem branch of the New York Public Library. And it operates like a New York Public Library on one hand, and then also an elite private university special collection at the others. It's actually quite amazing that on taxpayer dollars they are able to deliver the services that they do and have the work of such important figures. So the Schaumburg has Hansberry's paper, Baldwin's papers, Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, also once residents of Westchester County, so again, something special. Maya Angelou, the list goes on and on, Malcolm X's papers. And anyone can go make an appointment and look at the archives of any of the aforementioned figures and many, many more who I haven't named. And so it's free, open to the public, and it's just a wonderful resource. And so it's on 135th Street in Harlem, and I encourage you all to go there. Langston Hughes's ashes are in the ground in the Schaumburg. So you feel like it's it's a magical place. Yeah.
Okay, so the last line of your book is really beautiful, and I want to read it and just ask if you can talk about it and just what it means to you. Her, meaning Lorraine Hansberry's steadfast investment in life, the living of it every day as a protest forestalled death and despair, and uplifted the beauty of things black. The imposition of impossibility within possibility remains the work that awaits you.
So my first book and my first introduction to Hansberry was thinking about a medium, the theater, that renders things that are supposed to be fixed, movable. So you have sets and people's bodies and fixed things that are rendered permeable. And so one of the reasons why I think Hansberry liked to work in the theater is because she also revealed that structures and objects and characteristics that we think are fixed actually can be moved. And so the rendering of what we think is impossible actually is possible is the work that awaits us, and opening ourselves up to what would it mean actually if this could be different, if we could see this world differently, if we could see this thing that has been a stubborn part of our culture for 400 years not being a sore spot in our world anymore. What would it require of us to get there? And so she talked about seeing possibility and thinking about the future of possibility in her work and in her investment in realism, and not just the thing itself, but what is possible. That's how she described realism. Not just presenting what is, but what is possible. And so I was hoping that folks would read the book and run to Harlem and look at her papers and see the gift that she left for us that is waiting there for us. Because the other thing is, to my mind, she knew, y'all not ready for what I'm putting down in 1964 and 1965, but that's okay, because y'all are gonna catch up to me at some point. So I'm gonna leave all of this here for you. So once you catch up, it's waiting there for you.
Have we caught up?
I think we have a little time to ask one of the questions that are on our backup questions. So the website of the Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington states that a classical theater that does not speak to the present moment is a museum. Mm-hmm. We tell vital stories in audacious forms. So tell us about your work with this company.
So I'm really grateful to the Shakespeare Theater Company because since the new artistic director, who started, I'm going to say 2018-19, has been there, he's been really invested in expanding what we mean by the classics. So the Shakespeare Theater Company in DC is a classical theater, and so he's really invested in expanding what we mean by the classics. And although many U.S. theaters have done a lot of hard work post our racial reckoning of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd to have more egalitarian systems, Shakespeare was already doing that work before 2020. And so one of the projects that I've worked on with Shakespeare is Baldwin's Amen Corner, and it's the production of the play is important for several reasons, one of which being that in plays where you see Black folks on stage, there often aren't that many Black folks behind the scenes, so you don't have Black designers, you don't have Black directors, and so one of the things that the company was cognizant of giving opportunities to folks in different roles, like the costume designer, for example, and thinking about what does it mean to have a more diverse pool of artists and designers who are working on a play. And investing, this play has a lot of characters, and so it's cost a lot of money to produce. So the theater invested in producing this play and understanding Baldwin's play as a classic, even though it hasn't been produced that much in the United States. And so we're also developing new work. So I don't know if you're familiar with the novelist Paul Marshall. If you're not, you should. Her most well-known novel is called Praise Song for the Widow, but she also wrote a novel in 1959 called Brown Girl, Brownstone. And there is a play version that is in her archive. Her papers are going to the Schomburg. They're not there yet. And so we're producing a reading of that play this spring, and hopefully we will produce it. And so nurturing new works or works that have yet to be produced as plays, as well as bringing plays that we think should be classics or part of the canon into major productions as part of the work that's being done there. It's been a real gift to participate with a larger artistic team in doing some of this work.
Who are the Lorraine Hansberrys today? Who should we look for in the theater?
Oh, there's so many. We're really lucky. So there's this young woman named Erica Dickerson Dispenza who has a play that is being produced at the Public Theater this spring. So the actual production of Shadowland is being produced at the Public this spring. Brandon Jacob Jenkins, who's an amazing playwright and writes in all different genres. He's just so phenomenal. Dominique Morisseau, who I think is similar to Hansberry in the sense that she primarily writes in realism and writes a lot about specific place. So she's from Detroit and often is thinking about Detroit in her work, but is much more expansive than that. But one of the great things about this moment is that you have such a wide diversity of playwrights, Black playwrights, Latinx playwrights, Asian American playwrights, and Asian playwrights, that no one has to have the responsibility of being all things. Mm-hmm. And so Dominique Morisseau is doing her thing, which is very different from what Erica Dickerson Dispenza is doing and very different from Brandon Jacob Jenkins. And they all are being produced in really exciting ways. And I would say all the aforementioned have a similarity with different aspects of Hansberry's work. But what's exciting is that there is this larger cadre of artists of color whose work are being produced and we have access to. So I think that that's a really exciting difference from 1959, where you had, Hansberry was the only one, and it was many years before there were any other major productions by Black playwrights on Broadway or major regional theaters.
So you heard it here first. So now you know, pay attention. I think our last formal question for you is, what's next for you? Tell us what you're working on.
So I'm so glad I'm here. Maybe I'll make some friends and I'll be able to come back and bend your ears. So as you might have heard from some of my responses, I'm working on a book that is about a group of artists, Hansberry being one of them, that were friends and who in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, most of them moved to the Village in 1959. And again, it's picking up on this thread of thinking about this nucleus of activists and artists who came of age together. And so it began, originally the book was going to be about Baldwin, Hansberry, and Simone, but the group has expanded to include other folks, including Miriam Makeba, who was a South African artist, Ozzie Davis and Ruby Dee, Abby Lincoln and Max Roach, who are also a couple and friends with Maya Angelou, and all of whom hung out together, influenced one another, and in the early 50s, late 50s and early 60s lived in the Village, but then many of them moved to Westchester County. So I've been curious about what was up with, again, what's going on. So that's the current state of research, and I was just recently thinking about the fact that Nina Simone and Malcolm X lived in the same, and Malcolm X and their spouses lived in the same neighborhood here, and how they had impacts on each other's families and so forth. So yeah, just at the very beginning.
And then it'll be a Netflix series.
From your lips.
Well, you're welcome back anytime. Nicole? Do you have any other questions?
I have like a million questions.
Well,
do we want to open it up?
Yeah, we can absolutely open it up to our audience. By the way, thank you so
before
much
we
for
open
being
for
here.
questions, I do want to acknowledge the mayor of the great village of Croton on Hudson, New York, Mayor Pugh. So, questions. Here comes a microphone.
All right. First, before my question, I want to go back to when you first started, and you were talking about where you came from and how you were raised. I'm from Westchester, a town called Mamaroneck, New York, and I'm a classic Black baby boomer, born in 1950. So, as growing up, in 1965, when Lorraine passed, I was 15. Did not know who she was. Not only that, I didn't know who W. Du Bois was, Langston Hughes, anybody. But growing up, I did grow up in a town which is integrated, but I got the negative influences from the media about blackness. Matter of fact, we were not black then, we were colored. Negro wasn't really used, we were colored people. So I got the positive influences from, there was a significant black community in Mamaroneck where I got the positive influences. But Lorraine Hansberry came at a time when I was coming of age as a young black male in America, learning about Hansberry, Langston Hughes, Stokely Carmichael, and following the movement. That's how she came into my life. Also, in 1965, shortly before she passed, she went to the Apollo to greet some black journalists, and she told them that they were young, gifted, and black. And that became a catchphrase for my generation. We at the same time that we were shouting Black Power, we were singing Young, Gifted, and Black. Do you think that she would have been surprised by that movement, that a whole generation took that upon her?
I don't know if she would be surprised, and thank you for bringing that history to part of this conversation, because she does coin that phrase at the very end of her life, as you described it, and then Nina Simone writes the song, which becomes the anthem, and really takes over in terms of movement circles, becomes more widely sung than the Black National Anthem in movement circles post Hansberry's death. And Simone talks about in recordings how, you know, she's writing this song as in a way to mourn the death of her friend. She sings it in remembrance of Hansberry and then later Martin Luther King. So one of the things I think is important about the genealogy that you described is that Hansberry, even in 65, people are referring to themselves as black.
We still, that's right.
Right, and so when she says young, gifted, and black, it's a radical statement.
Exactly.
Because she's claiming that identity category, that naming in ways that is not in vogue yet, and it's not in really until Stokely Carmichael later says in 66,
1966,
Black Power,
that was it.
Blackness becomes the preferred description of young folks and movement folks. And so she is anticipating this worldview that understands the movement as a global movement for black freedom, because she's already been thinking about how the post-colonial movements in Africa and Latin America from the 50s are an important part of black people getting free and people being free in the US, you know, well before Black Power and her uttering that phrase. So I'm grateful for you drawing our attention to that history, because it just shows again that although now, you know, many people refer to themselves as black, in 65 when she says it, that's not the case.
Not the case. That changed when Stokely Carmichael said it in 66.
Mm-hmm.
Next line.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I have a Lorraine Hansberry adjacent question. It's not specifically about her. I'd just like to hear your thoughts about the play Clybourne Park.
You know, what are your thoughts about the play Clybourne Park?
Well, I'm sure not everybody's interested in my opinion. I thought it was interesting. I mean, I don't want to give it away for those who haven't seen it, because I know it comes back periodically. It came back once since winning the Tony Award for the best play years ago. And basically it's about, well, Clybourne Park is the place where in the Raisin in the Sun, the family moves to. And then the play, you fast forward 30 years maybe, and the neighborhood goes from all white to all black, basically, white flight. And then in the play, it's gentrifying. So
I mean, I think that one of the things that frustrates me about these plays Clybourne Park is one among many plays that imagine what happens once the youngers move. And one of my frustrations is, to my reading, there's an assumption that Lorraine Hansberry is naive about what awaits the youngers once they move. That she thinks that once they move, everything's gonna be great and they'll just be, you know, all the problems are solved and they've just moved into this neighborhood and the goal is desegregation or integration, depending on how it's phrased. And then again, we've done this, we've moved into the house, we've gotten to the neighborhood, and our work is done. And that reading completely misunderstands her personal history, misunderstands her understanding of how movements work, misunderstands her clear historical, both personal and in terms of her being a student of history, of how violence almost always adheres anytime there is any progress as it relates to race in America. There's always a backlash, and she knew that. So she was not naive about that, and the version of the play at the Beinecke shows that. Even in the ending of A Raising the Sun, that is the one that is produced, there's no, it's ambivalent at the end. We don't know what's going to happen. And so that is my, I guess, apprehension, concern, response to Norris's play, because again, I think that Hansberry would have seen moving, as Hansberry talks about in the Mike Wallace interview, that it's not the moving that's the important part of Raising the Sun. It's that Walter Lee makes a decision and a choice. And it is in those moments of what she calls affirmation that we are transformed as people. And so fixating on what happens after they move is missing part of the point of the play. And so that's also a little bit frustrating for me, because it's like you're missing the forest for the trees. Most of the activists who were living in the North during the Civil Rights Movement period although everything was segregated, their primary concern was not integration. They saw integration as a strategy. They didn't see it as the goal. And so having clarity about that, I think, is important in understanding the play, and then also thinking about what work these plays that are responding to it are doing. But I still think everyone should watch it and come up with their own opinions.
And they will all write to you.
Yes, you should see what you all think, yes.
I teach middle school. I don't know if I need a mic, but so one thing I grapple with as a white woman teaching in a predominantly white, county like Westchester County is I encounter students and other individuals who are really centered in whiteness, not like at fault, but like a lot of my students go to really expensive camps, and then they're around other mostly white peers during the day, and I don't know how to open a door to this learning. And it's like, I think the people who need the door open, they're not here right now. So so how do you and maybe you don't even do that. Maybe you just worry about doing your own small acts, like you mentioned, every day. But if you wanted to, especially as a teacher of young people or like a high school teacher, I mean, you're encountering your college students, how do you reach out to especially young people who don't, they can say that they're aware of these issues, but who don't really live these issues?
I try to focus in my teaching on offering students an opportunity to see what the facts are about the realities of the world. So one of the strategies that I use, for example, is there are maps of the segregation that still exists in Chicago that are mapped from the 50s to the late 2010s, are the most recent that I've seen of these maps. And you can literally go slide by slide and say, okay, this is the demographic breakdown of Chicago in the 1950s, and the 60s, and the 70s. And you see over time that although Chicago gets more diverse, so there's more Asian Americans or Asian folks living in Chicago, there's more Latinx folks living in Chicago, they're all living together. So Chicago becomes more diverse over time, but it does not become less segregated. And so just showing students, why do you think in 2010, Chicago, why do you think? Let's talk about why this exists as a demographic fact in our world today, post Fair Housing Act. and just have the students grapple with the reality of the ways in which we live today. And so it's not about convincing anyone of your point of view, but rather giving them access to the information, right, and helping them to develop critical thinking skills that will help them make sense of the world that they live in. And so often, you know, our young folks are well-equipped if they're given access to the information. And so presenting the information is often a good entry point, even if you might be encountering students who at first glance might think that they're in opposition to the material you're trying to present. So I taught a class, I co-edited a book called The Psychic Code of Slavery. And the co-editor and I taught a class on the material. And we had a student in our class who was a senior economics major, a lovely young man. And we talked about this concept called racial capitalism. And it basically explains that although we like to say in the United States that we are run by free markets, right? So the market decides. There's an audible resistance that, although we like to say we live in a free market society, there's lots of examples in our tax codes on both sides of the ways that our laws are manipulating the markets for certain outcomes. And part of that story is how wealth has been accumulated over time from slavery to the present, and the intersection of slavery and the development of capitalism in the US and the Western world, right? These are facts. This is just what it is. And so our student said, Professor Colbert, I don't know how I was an economics major, I'm getting ready to graduate from Georgetown, and no one ever mentioned this in one of my economics classes. I'm so glad that now I have access to this information. And so, you know, again, he obviously elected to take this course, so there was already an openness on his part. But I do think that just giving students access to material, allowing them to decipher it can be one way in. And again, helping them to understand that the world you currently live in was very different even 20, 30 years ago can be helpful.
I think it goes back to what you said before, too, about Brown versus Board and all of the struggle prior to that decision. It's like, I only recently learned about Rosa Parks, right? We know that story, but what was going on before that was a woman-driven movement of women trying to get on buses all over the country and being physically harassed and assaulted and saying, like, this can't happen, I need to take the bus to work. And it was perpetuating, and it moved to the larger civil rights movement and then to the choosing of Rosa Parks to sit on that bus. And so, like, the fact that, you know, it's really painful that our kids get these very sort of whitewashed and one-dimensional people that show up in their learning with no idea of how long this violence was perpetuated. And I just, even the moving, you know, even a black family moving into a white neighborhood, I mean, over and over again, they'd be getting the furniture out of the truck and people would be like burning it while they were, you know, the fact that, like, I understand you don't want to tell a kindergartner that, but at some point you've got to tell kids who can digest it and understand where we were and why we're here.
Right.
You know, and I think we do such a disservice to them. It's not good for their brains, it's not good for their hearts, it's not our story.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that is helpful with students is just asking probing questions. Like, Brown versus Board of Education is 1954. So why did we need the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee? Why did we need them to sit in 1960? Why do we need that? Why do we need sit-ins if the Supreme Court has found that in public places it's illegal to segregate? And so just beginning to think about how the states, we were talking about this backstage, the states were defying the laws. The federal government had to physically go in with officers to force the states to enforce the court's ruling. And that young people were putting their bodies on the line to force the hand of a federal government that was resistant to intervening. is part of helping us to understand how things have changed in our society. And so just, begging students to think about how these pieces of the puzzle fit together, I think is important. Yeah.
And if I could just add one point to that, this isn't so long ago. Ruby Bridges, who was a 6-year-old, that was one of the first students to integrate, is 69 years old today. Yeah. Same age as our county executive. It's not ancient history.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Thank you for this beautiful, informative panel. So 2 things I wanted to mention. You mentioned about Nina Simone and Malcolm X, that they were neighbors. We're hoping that you'll come back to Westchester in June. They are having a celebration of Nina Simone for Black History Music Month. Oh. So hopefully you'll join us for that. They'll have proclamations and a full day in Mount Vernon in her hometown. Oh, wow. So I'll share the date with Linda. Secondly, I wanted to touch on if you could give us your understanding of the Black family with regard to Lorraine Hansberry's interpretation of it. I don't know if you could answer that question, but I think it's very pertinent because I do feel that 400 years later, we are still suffering as a people from post-traumatic slavery syndrome. We see that even with Tyree Nichols, who was beaten relentlessly by his own Black people, and I think that maybe that they felt that they could get away with it with impunity. Yeah. So we still carry the vestiges of slavery with us in the way that we treat each other. And I wanted to uplift Hansberry at that time because the Black family has been destroyed practically as a result of slavery in terms of the roles. But nonetheless, she still highlighted the Black man even with regard to his frailties. And I was wondering, shout out to the brothers in here who came out today. I was wondering your thoughts on Lorraine Hansberry's thoughts on the Black family.
Well, she certainly grew up in a traditional family. Both of her parents were college educated, middle class. We would consider them in today's terms a power couple is how I describe them in the book. And both really deeply invested in being good citizens and being politically active. Hansberry personally, I don't think that Hansberry was as invested in the heteronormative family, and you see that in her personal relationships. So I think that she sees her political allies as part of her family. So Paul Robeson, Nina Simone, James Baldwin, as a part of her most intimates. And having that flexibility around family relationships is important to her. I think that she sees the work that they were doing together as really forming the basis of what we might think of today as a family relationship and a kinship. And at the same time, I do think that she wanted to honor what type of political possibility is nurtured in intimate spaces like the home, which are often, particularly in the 50s and early 60s, women's spaces. So one of the things that I talked about with the actors who are putting on Signing Sidney Brustein's Window, which is mostly about a white family, was a question of why Hansberry's 3 big plays are all taking place really around family dramas. So Raising the Sun, Signing Sidney Brustein's Window, and LeBlanc are all really family dramas. And one of the reasons why I think she does that is, again, because I think she saw these intimate family relationships as the building blocks for freedom movements and possibility in society, and how wrangling with those you love the most, you hold dearest, is part of what is necessary for transformation. So I do think that it's useful that she gives us powerful, tragic heroes in, a classical dramatic sense, that are everyday people as a mode of possibility and for our dreaming, and that and from a feminist perspective, that those narratives are interlaced with prototypically female spaces of the home. Yeah.
Any more questions?
I spent 2 years when I was 17 and 18 in Pretoria, South Africa. So I witnessed and experienced racism. And 40 years later, I still feel very traumatized by it. It's just right below the surface. So I live here now in Westchester, and I'm so grateful to such a woman who made a difference. And even though she lived such a short life, she burned so brightly, and to have someone like you, so articulate and intelligent, to translate and be inspired so much by her so many years later is really inspiring.
Oh, thank you. You probably could give me some insight about Mary McCabe, who is from South Africa and came to the United States in 1959 and then became an exile because she was speaking out against apartheid, and her government wouldn't let her return to South Africa. And so helped to further draw attention to the international aspects of Black freedom movements among Hansberry and her friend group during that time period. Yeah.
This is sort of a different direction. So I'm really interested in your thoughts about Lorraine Hansberry's thoughts about liberals. I think many of us live in what we might call a Westchester blue liberal bubble, and that's one of the reasons maybe we're here today. But I don't think that Lorraine Hansberry was so I think she wanted to explore and expose some of the contradictions and and what makes that problematic. And I'd be curious to hear you talk about that.
So Hansberry has a speech where she asks for her white liberal friends to stop being liberals and become radicals. And she and you can listen to this. Yeah, you can listen to this on the BAM website. She gives a speech at the end of her life, and she, although because of sexism, did not know that she had cancer, which is its own. I mean, it was a different time. Like, we have to sort of understand the time when she was operating, and I think the reason why I keep emphasizing that is because, to me, it makes her even that much more remarkable. But she knew that something was. I think that she knew that she was dying, and she kind of writes in her journals that if this is just, they told her she had ulcers. And so she says, if this is just an ulcer, then I don't know how I could survive ulcers, because I literally, she was in so much pain. And so she gives this speech at the end of her life, and in my reading of it, she knows that she's very ill and realizes that she needs to put some pressure on the acceleration of the work that needs to be done and leaving her legacy. And so throughout her life and career, she is in coalition with folks across racial groups, gender, across difference. And she's deeply invested in building coalition across difference. And she also thinks that she wants her white liberal friends from the village, which is where she was living, to do and be something different in the world. And so the speech is an example of that. And what I think that means materially is really thinking about how to expand access. And by access, I think Hansberry understood that in a very material sense, because she was a leftist, she was a progressive. And so again, this idea that what would it mean for us as a society to decide that every human being's basic needs should be met. And so when we think about, what can we do, the tax codes that govern your county, your state, are actually very much in all of our reach, right? Those are things that as small communities we decide on together, and we could create tax codes that make it such that everyone's basic needs are met, right? But that would mean that folks like me who get paid well would have to have less, right? That's a choice. And so in that speech, I think she's putting pressure on that to say, what does it mean for certain folks to have a lot and for others to not, and for us to be okay with that, because we're willing to donate a few dollars for a rally. Like, that's not enough. We need to do more.
I don't think I need the mic. I'm struck throughout. No, I'll take this one. I'm struck throughout by your use of the present tense about people who are long dead. And, well, maybe it's a little blunt way of putting it, but you know what I mean. And on the one hand, I thought maybe this is a rhetorical strategy of some sort. On the other hand, could you explain your point of view in the use of present tense in talking about these people?
So part of it is me trying to ask us to consider the ongoing nature of their work, which is to say that when I think about culture, I think about, which is primarily what I'm often writing about, I think about it as a living thing, right? So it's something that even if the authors are long dead, that there is a way when we interact with a play or we interact with a song, that it has an ongoing resonance, it has an ongoing unfolding in time and place. And so that's part of the strategy of using the present tense. But the other piece is, and I suppose this might be slightly more controversial, but thinking about how our engagement with Hansberry's work is part of our understanding of who she is in the world, right? So that part of her life's work was as a writer, and understanding her life is still unfolding because we're still discovering things about her. And so that there is a presentness to our telling her story, to the way we understand her, to the ongoing impact of her work in the world. So, yeah, that's what drives that choice.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. Curious what you and or Lorraine would think of the current sort of Black conservative movement and how it squares with everything we're talking about here today.
Well, you know, she got dragged by Harold Cruz in the Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and so there is a longer history of Black conservatism that coincided with Hansberry's life, and I think that she would be disappointed, sad. I mean, but I don't think that Hansberry was often in spaces where there was something about her that was different, even if much about her was the same. So let me say that more clearly. When Hansberry was writing for Marxist periodicals, which she did, she often wrote from the perspective of a woman, because often the Marxists were men who were writing. When Hansberry was writing to lesbian periodicals, she would often highlight the position of being a Black woman. She was constantly in spaces where she was different in some way, and so I don't think that she aligned race with uniformity, because she understood that there were lots of ways she was always different in the world. And so I think she would have been just as concerned, curious, if you want to be more diplomatic, about white conservatives as she would be about Black conservatives. And she would want to know, how is this point of view serving you, and how is this getting us towards what presumably is our shared interest in having a full and flourishing expression of American democracy?
Thank you all very much for your questions. Nicole will have the last word on this. But before we do that, I want to let everyone know that Andy, our bookseller, owner of Buy the Damn Books, is lonely over there. And so what he's hoping for is, once we break, that you'll all walk over there and buy a book or two, and Professor Colbert will be happy to sign the book. Nicole.
Yeah, thank you truly everyone for coming today. This is the first one of 5 Towns, 1 Book. This is our 3rd year, and this is our first year that we have our author here in person. And I think it's really, it's kind of a tribute, I think, to what we're talking about building community and about bringing us together. And so it feels really, really good, and I feel really blessed. All my Cure members, thank you for being here. I want to thank LMC Media for streaming and recording today. Linda, I'm so glad that our paths crossed because the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition is an incredible and mighty force that will continue to live here in the county, and I hope we continue to work together. Tejas, thank you so much for being here from the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, and Gwen for the library. And really, last but not least, Professor Colbert, you are just a gift to us, and I appreciate your time so much. Thank you. Thank you.